Robert, do you work with Portuguese as well in your translations?
No, these days it's getting very rusty, and I'm just glad for any opportunity to stay tuned just a little bit.
But if I spoke in Portuguese, could you understand? You said that you wanted to practice.
Because it's Brazilian Portuguese, it might be a bit more tricky because I'm more used to continental, mas pode falar.
Sergio here is from Spain, from Barcelona, and he just spoke to us in Portuguese, a perfect Portuguese, but European Portuguese.
Pois, claro.
A minha professora era lisboeta, então o meu sotaque é português também.
Yeah, but it's a really good Portuguese. Muito bom teu português. Muito bom mesmo. Eu ia dizer que tu és um português de Portugal, assim, nativo.
Tuga.
Mas você consegue entender bem quando eu falo em português do Brasil?
Sim, atualmente para mim é mais fácil compreender o português do Brasil.
Sério?
É muito mais, para mim é muito mais similar ao espanhol, é muito mais fácil de entender.
É que eu acho que também na Flórida, você está morando na Flórida, né? Acho que na Flórida tem mais brasileiros também, né? Como você ouve português, é mais do Brasil.
Sim, e o português do Brasil é muito mais cantado, muito mais... Não sei.
O meu é um pouco menos, porque é do Sul, né? A gente tem bastante influência dos vizinhos, do Uruguai e Argentina. Okay, guys.
But, you know, like...
If we're leaving half of the people out of the conversation, Sérgio. Speaking Portuguese. Hello, you're all cold there. And here I have a fan in front of me. You're all full of cold. Now it's summer in Brazil, even in the region I'm living in. We don't really have winters like.
Hello?
Hi, Tom, now I can hear you.
Hello?
I think you froze a little bit.
Hello?
Hi.
Hello?
Hello, Tom. Tom froze. Okay, I gave 5 minutes, right, for us to start. I'm still receiving good morning everyone that I haven't spoke to.
Hello?
Bom dia. Hello, Tom.
Hello?
Hi, Tom.
Hello?
Can you all hear me well? Just Tom is not listening. Hello, Tom.
Hi, I was suddenly losing audio and video. I have no idea what happened.
Can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Nice, Tom. All right. Yeah,
Okay.
Google Meet is a bit buggy sometimes. But if I don't use Google Meet, we don't have the time span, because it's the one we use here at the university. We have the Google Suite, the whole plan with Google and stuff. So
If anything happens, I will try to connect again.
all right. And I check your email every now and then, because if you fall or something, I'll let you know. Okay, everyone. I think I'll do something as I was planning with Amarildo, our monitor today, and the one who made the arts and everything for our medias. Amarildo is here to monitor them, but I was planning to with him that I should speak first in Portuguese and then in English, okay? So if you hear a lot of Portuguese, don't worry, because I'll switch to English soon. All right. Ok. Bom dia, então, pessoal. Eu decidi, né, fazer essa abertura para explicar um pouquinho, né, o porquê que eu decidi organizar esse evento, né, e também para agradecer, né, o interesse de todos vocês. Então, bom dia, né, primeiramente. E por que um evento internacional sobre psicolinguística do multilinguismo, né? Então, eu estava falando antes com uma das nossas pioneiras aqui no Brasil, né, de psicolinguística, Maílce Mota, que está aqui nos assistindo também. É uma honra, né? Que não existem muitos eventos, né, direcionados para a psicolinguística do multilinguismo, né? A gente encontra esse tema, às vezes, encaixadinho em algum evento maior sobre linguística ou psicolinguística, que estão acontecendo com mais frequência. Nem psicolinguística a gente tinha muitos, né? Agora, um número crescente de pessoas tem se interessado, né, pela psicolinguística, e ainda, né, pelo tema, pelas interfaces, né, com a psicolinguística do multilinguismo. Então, vocês observam que cada dia, né, que eu programei ali para nós, estão direcionados, né, para uma área específica também da psicolinguística do multilinguismo, né, ou seja, uma interface. No primeiro dia, a gente tem um dia mais aberto, né, mais geral da psicolinguística do multilinguismo, mas no dia seguinte a gente já tem psicolinguística do multilinguismo da fala, né, no dia posterior a gente tem a psicolinguística do multilinguismo relacionado a línguas indígenas, né? E também, no último dia, psicolinguística do multilinguismo relacionado à tradução. Então, a gente vê que tem muitas interfaces que a gente pode fazer, mas não existia ainda um evento, né, que tratasse especificamente da psicolinguística do multilinguismo. E nada melhor para abrir esse dia do que um professor, né, em psicolinguística do multilinguismo, que é o Tom, né? O Tom vai falar conosco hoje. A primeira, né, é professor, ou seja, o título mais alto, né, de um pesquisador na Holanda, né, dentro da área da psicolinguística do multilinguismo, né? Então, a gente vai ter o prazer de ouvir ele, né, como essa palestra de abertura. Eu fiquei muito feliz com a repercussão que teve, né, esse convite para esse congresso. Eu coloquei em vários meios, né, e ele atingiu lugares, assim, que eu nem imaginei que iam chegar. Por exemplo, nós temos muitos participantes, né, ouvintes, de vários países da África, de países da Ásia, de vários países da Europa, dos Estados Unidos, de várias universidades dos Estados Unidos, e do Brasil inteiro, gente. De norte a sul, a gente tem pessoas que vão ouvir, né? E o nosso país é muito grande, né? Então, envolveu muita gente. E também, de igual forma, vocês podem olhar pelo programa, os apresentadores de trabalhos orais, né? Também a gente teve propostas do mundo inteiro, né? E também do Brasil inteiro. Então, é uma coisa que me deixa muito feliz, né? Que esse convite tenha chegado a tantas pessoas e que, no fim, eu descobri que não é uma área assim tão pequena, né? Porque tem muitas pessoas interessadas e muitas pessoas trabalhando nisso. Então, nada mais justo do que a gente dedicar, de fato, um evento, né, para esse tema. Então, eu fico feliz de ter sido, né, até onde eu sei, a primeira, né, a pensar em fazer um evento desses, e até onde a Maílce me confirmou também, e fico feliz com a sugestão dela, que a gente coloque esse evento na rodada, né, no calendário de eventos da psicolinguística no Brasil, e talvez no mundo, porque eu acho que eu também não vi, assim, na época na Europa, a gente com um evento específico para psicolinguística do multilinguismo por lá também. Então, muito obrigada pela presença de vocês, pelo interesse de vocês, e eu espero que seja um momento, assim, muito bom para todos nós, de troca, de aprendizado, de convívio um pouco com pessoas do Brasil inteiro e do mundo inteiro, que é uma coisa que nos possibilita, né, um congresso online, que a gente descobriu, né, numa época meio ruim das nossas vidas aí, né, no período de pandemia, esse recurso, mas eu penso que a gente pode continuar usando ele, né, mesmo em momentos mais felizes, para integrar de maneira mais democrática também, né, as pessoas, porque ouvir uma pessoa como o Tom, né, é muito difícil para nós aqui no Brasil, mas via um evento online se torna mais fácil, né? Ok? Então, bem-vindos e ótimo evento para todos. Agora eu vou falar um pouquinho em inglês. Okay, I'll switch to English now. I'll try to say more or less the same things. It won't be exactly the same. But yeah, so mainly I was talking to everyone concerning the need we had, right, for a conference related specifically to psycholinguistics of multilingualism, because as far as I know, here in Brazil, we had none, and Mayusi Mota, who is listening to us, also confirmed that in Brazil, at least, we had none, right, before. It was also, the theme was there, but always within another conference, like either in psycholinguistics or general linguistics, right? But none specific to the theme of psycholinguistics of multilingualism. And the nice thing is that not just the pioneering idea, but also how nice it was that this invitation reached many different places, right? We have attendees from different countries, from Africa, from Asia, from many countries in Europe, also from the US, many places, many universities in the US, and in Brazil, all over, from all over Brazil, like from south to north, from east to west, and it's quite a big country, so it was quite nice how this invitation turned out, right? The turnout of this invitation. And also similarly are the presenters, right? The oral presentations also go in this direction, because we have people from Europe, from Africa, from Asia. Also, it was quite difficult to deal with the time differences, right? So I had to have that in mind when I was building the program. And there's a person from Japan, actually, so that was the most difficult, because it's 12 time plus in relation to Brazil. So, but we managed. And so it's quite interesting and quite wonderful. It's wonderful, actually, right, that we have all this opportunity of interaction with people from all over the world, and I'm really happy that it happened. And nothing better for a congress on psycholinguistics of multilingualism than a professor speaking to us, who is a professor on the psycholinguistics of multilingualism, such as Tom, right? Tom is...
Hi, everybody.
Tom is specifically, but many of you probably know him from his publications. And this is the nice thing about Congress and online Congress, right? Because it makes it a bit more democratic, in the sense that if we were to bring Tom to Brazil, it wouldn't be possible, because the university, unfortunately, doesn't provide us money, not even for a folder or anything. So yeah, this is interesting to highlight that we had no financial aid for this program. So we did all with our work and zero money. As we follow, you probably follow the news in Brazil, you know the situation with the current government. but we have hopes for the next one. And yeah, so it makes it a little more democratic in the sense that even people that wouldn't have the chance of listening to Tom's presentation live, right, in presence, now we can listen to his work and to his wisdom like online, right? So thank you very much, Tom, also for accepting and for supporting with your presence this event. And so to everyone who was interested and submitted papers and subscribed as attendees, I thank you all very much for also supporting and making part of it. And I hope we all have a good time of sharing and acquiring knowledge and exchanging ideas. So this is, I think, is the most important thing. Thank you all very much. So should we wait a little bit? So that was my opening. Nothing. And should we wait a little bit because we allotted the Tom's lecture for 9:30, right? So we could wait a little bit. So let's have a break and then we come back.
So Amanda, I will try to put on the first slide already so that
Sure.
everything is available, right?
Sure.
Okay, so let's do that. All right. Okay. Let's see. Does this work? Amanda, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so this is my opening slide, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll leave it on then.
But try to pass the slides. Sometimes just let me see quickly if you can pass them.
If I can what? Can do what?
If you can pass the other slides as well. Right.
Okay, yes, I will. I should send you an email, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes, if anything happens, I can help you out. But
Okay.
yeah, usually if it works the first time, it works all along.
Yeah, but I agree. So then I need to go out a bit. Let me see. I forgot to do that. Okay. Good. You're still there? Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Amanda, I sent you the PowerPoint presentation just in case it's necessary.
Thank you.
But if I'm correct, you can see my first slide now, right?
Yeah, it's all good. And you could pass the other slides as well, so it will work. But if something happens,
Wonderful.
I'll let you know. But
Good.
it usually doesn't happen if you... Okay, I just got your emails. Your email.
It should have the word new in the title, right?
I'm sorry, Tom, I couldn't understand.
Well, the title of the lecture has the word new in it, right?
Yes.
Good.
Já tá
I
aí.
have the correct version.
I have Jataí Brazil here. Okay. I just got me another coffee and I'll come back soon. Bom dia para quem chegou agora. Nós estamos esperando o horário das 9h30 para começar. Mas deixa eu ver quem novo chegou aqui. Tem um pessoal que eu conheço das redes sociais, mas que eu não conheço pessoalmente. Obrigada, pessoal, por seguirem lá. Eu reconheço alguns nomes. Eu tenho os cachorros aqui em volta, não se assustem se tiver um barulhinho de cachorro. Tem os cachorros aqui em volta, não se assustem. I have some dogs around, so I'm sorry if you hear a bark here and there. That's the online thing, right? So this is the only problem. Good morning, Daniele. Thank you, Leonardo, for your words. I agree. We not often have the chance of exchanging ideas in our specific or more or less specific field of research, right? So you're welcome. So may we start, Tom? May I present you a little bit?
Thank you. Yes, please do.
I hope I don't disappoint. Well, this is Tom Dijkstra. Many of you may know him by his publications. He is a professor in psycholinguistics of multilingualism. Now he is emeritus, right? Quite recently. And he used to and he still does research on the Institute for Brain, Cognition, and Behavior.
Shit.
Now we have the pleasure
Excuse me, Professor Amanda. Your audio is freezing, and your image too.
I'm sorry, I have problems with my audio. I don't hear you very well, Amanda. I haven't heard what you were saying just now. Hello? Hello?
I think we're all having audio problems.
Okay, can we resolve that? Should I try connecting again?
Probably it's Amanda's side. I don't know how that works out.
Okay, so if you tell me what I should do, I can start the lecture if you can hear me, but please interrupt when you don't hear me. All right, okay, so let's start. And please indicate it immediately when there is an audio problem or a visual problem, right? I can always connect again. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, good. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I'm really honored to be invited by Amanda to give a presentation on this very special symposium or conference, the first one in Brazil. And in the coming days, we will hear a lot about many studies on bilingualism. But of course, we have to take a little bit a step back as well and realize that our ultimate challenge is, of course, to build a language processing system that accounts for both monolingual and bilingual language processing and learning. So in this lecture, this opening lecture, I want to present a general framework for bilingual research and monolingual research that I've been working on all these years. And then I will zoom in on our computational model for word retrieval called Multilink. And Multilink can be used for both monolingual and bilingual word retrieval. And it's my hope that the framework that I will present and the modeling research that I will present will be particularly informative and inspiring also for our younger research colleagues, PhDs, and postdocs. So here is the organization of the lecture. I will use a kind of a funnel approach. After discussing theoretical and modeling issues, I will zoom in part 3 on 3 empirical and simulation studies. And I'm happy that I will be able to present a study on European Portuguese as well. And then I will end with a very brief summary and conclusion. And I hope that you have questions that I may answer after the lecture. So when you go to textbooks on language, they usually present a patchwork of theories and experiments on the basis of research done by linguists and psycholinguists or psychologists of language. So can we come closer together by working in a shared theoretical framework? In our book that will appear around June 2023 with Routledge, David Peters and I, we consider language and its use in a broader framework. What components are needed to understand language use? How should we describe the language processing system? What are language users actually doing? Okay, well, when you start to think about what you need to describe language and its use, you come to the conclusion that you need a number of components. First, you need to somehow represent the units that are important in a particular language, and also along with the rules, and these representations and rules are stored in long-term memory. For instance, we have the rules of phonetics, phonology, syntax, and so on. Second, we also need machinery that can handle the representations and turn the input wave of spoken speech or the printed string of letters on paper into a kind of a mental model in a mental meaning representation. So we need processing components and also processes that convert the input into a meaningful mental representation. In order to do so, we also need cognitive control. And we know that cognitive control, for instance, is very important in bilinguals. And it has to do with attention and monitoring, making sure that all the intermediary products of processing will be correct, can be safely stored temporarily in working memory. So working memory is the fourth component. And then, of course, what we would like to make possible that that different languages could be put into the same language user framework, or LOVE, as I've called it in the title of my lecture. And of course, we will also want this to be representable in theories that relate to the brain. So this framework, this LOVE I was talking about, was proposed by Gerard Kempen and me already in a book in 1984. It sums up and organizes the activity of language users in terms of this framework. And in this framework, we integrate notions from the various linguistic disciplines in order to specify the representations and processes that must be part of the language system of language users. So, for instance, we discerned phonetic, phonological levels of representation, lexical, morpholexical representations, syntactic levels, and semantic levels of representation. And in this figure, you can see all of this together. And it's actually from the same kind of perspective that Pim Leveld in 1989 formulated his model on language production. So as you can see in this framework, there is a comprehension side and a production side. And there is stored information, usually studied by linguists, and there are processes and components that are studied by psycholinguists. And this all now is organized into a systematic system. So we will describe this language user framework extensively in the book that I was talking about. So we stress that the language user system must also have a task decision component to it, because when we are using language, users perform various tasks, both in the laboratory and in real life. And already in 1998, David Green put forward the notion of a task schema, a series of computational steps governed by an executive control system that a language user must follow in order to perform a particular language task. And David Green focused on language production and developed this model into the model with Abou-Talebi and Green, where the brain is also very important. But already in 1998, also in my own research with Van Jaarsveld and Ten Brinke, we came to similar conclusions for language comprehension. And since then, the notion of a task decision system or executive control system has become more and more prominent and even indispensable in my own research and in the research by others. So as you can see here, when we have different tasks, they require us to retrieve different codes from our language user framework. For instance, when we do lexical decision on a printed string of words, we have to retrieve orthographic representations. When we name a particular word that we see on paper, we have to retrieve phonology, so that's a different code. And when we have to categorize a particular word semantically, for instance, is this object greater or smaller than a computer, we have to retrieve semantic codes. There is also a translation, which is a very interesting and very complex task. Here we have to retrieve the orthography and the semantics, and we produce the phonology in one or more multiple languages. So controlling these tasks requires task schemas. The language user framework started as a general framework for language use and was built on different organizing principles. In particular, we favor a symbolic approach. And this also because symbols allow us to easily communicate about research. I'm doing that now. I'm using symbols to talk about the language processing system. Interpretation is easy. Symbols can easily be put into a logical system or a mathematical system. They are quantifiable and generalizable. Using symbols to talk about reality does not imply that one does not recognize or acknowledge that the units of reality are actually of a much finer grain size, or that talking about language in terms of distributed representation may not also be useful. But symbols can be seen as shortcuts. As long as they help us to capture the basic patterns underlying language, they are quite useful. And in the love, they are integrated in a hierarchical and incremental model. I showed you that on the last slide. So the same holds for distinctions made in love about different tasks. Tasks are not fully modular, as we thought. When Fodor presented his Modularity of Mind book in the 80s, but we still think about these different activities and these different components in terms of a sort of mental organs. They do communicate to other organs, and they can be studied on their own, but they are not completely modular in Fodor's sense. They are locally interactive. And in the book that I was talking about, we will show how this notion is very fruitful for recognizing printed language, spoken language, and sign language. So we hope that will help us to unify different language activities in one model. It's also important to stress that language use is systematic, but has been found to be extremely sensitive to contextual effects. So the observed language use is dependent on many different variables. When we have a bilingual, we have the language or languages that the person speaks, their specific combination, the distance between the language, the script that the language is being presented in, all its properties. That is very important. At a slightly smaller or lower level, we have the participant groups that we are studying. We have monolinguals and bilinguals. We have heritage speakers of language. We have children, we have adults, and we have patients. So somehow, all these groups should be being put together in a framework where everybody recognizes and that everybody shares. Very importantly, and often neglected by linguists, is the fact that our language use is also sensitive to the tasks that we are conducting. So the different tasks are more or less complex. They are of different types. They may concern comprehension, production, or translation. And in the laboratory, the tasks that we perform are actually not the language use per se, but they are the language use as it is being done within a particular constraint, the constraint of the task. And then at an even lower, smaller level, of course, we have specific stimulus materials. We would like to understand letters, words, phrases, and sentences, but also phonemes, spoken words, intonation patterns, and suprasegmental information. And we would like to all of this to end up with a meaning representation in terms of a kind of a mental model that represents the whole physical and psychological and social situation at hand. In my own research, the units that I found very important and very interesting to consider were cognates, interlingual homographs, translation equivalence, and so on. Okay, so this is the kind of a background in which I've worked over the years. And I always thought it was important that our verbal theories of language should also become more quantified and more precise. So we need to go beyond just qualifying language and its use in terms of words. We need, in my opinion, certain computational models. So computational models can be seen as specifications of our theories. They make verbal theory more precise. They simplify reality with a particular goal in mind. So you could say, as you can see here, we have general theories and we have computational models, and they are sketches. They represent a particular phenomenon from a particular perspective. So when you draw a face like this, you can draw it en face or en profile. It's not the case that one of the faces is better than the other. They simply represent a different side of the face and a different facet of the face. So I think that computational models are very interestingly because they allow us to understand underlying mechanisms and quantify those mechanisms and their effects. So in order to quantify bilingual word retrieval, we have developed the multilink model and the multilink plus model. Multilink specifies the representations in the mental lexicon, as you can see here under 1 and 2. It also specifies how the resulting activation is used in the task at hand. So that's specified under 3 and 4. An important assumption of parsimony that is made in our model is that the activation in the system itself is not changed by the task demands that are required in the situation. So the activation process going on in the lexical identification network or the language processing network is always the same, but the way that it is used is dependent on the task and the language context. We believe that there is evidence also in the brain that supports this kind of notion. Okay, so let's discuss these different components in more detail. First of all, we have the lexical network or the lexicon. We consider this as a kind of a triangle phonological and semantic representations. Maybe you know about the triangle network proposed by Plot and Schellers and others. Many of these psychological theories have this kind of a triangle in them. So all these words in this network can now belong to one or more languages. So for instance, the orthography could be from an input that is an L1 word or a native language word, or it could be from a second language or even a third language or more. So all words belong to a particular language. And during reading, the input word activates different orthographic representations, possibly from different languages. And when you are listening, then you would have an input probably from the other side of the triangle, where you derive phonological representations. Anyway, as soon as a word input enters the mental lexicon, there will be an information stream going to the other nodes, and there will be a kind of a resonance that finally, ultimately results in the recognition of a word. So the multilingual lexicon contains word translations for several languages. And whole number of people have collaborated with me on constructing this larger lexicon, and a lexicon for different languages. So as you can see, by now we have made lexicons for Dutch, English, but also Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, Japanese Kana, and Chinese, and we are working on German at this moment in time. So each item in the lexicon has its own characterization in terms of orthography, phonology, and semantics, and it also has its own frequency properties that are usually derived from the databases with subtitles and their frequencies. Fortunately, there are more and more of these databases from different languages. When experimental data are available, the outcome patterns of multilingual can then be compared to these data. And we can find mean reaction times, for instance, in the English lexicon project, the British lexicon project, the Dutch lexicon project, other lexicon projects, but also in empirical studies. So if you have a study in Spanish or Portuguese, or on Portuguese-English lexical decision, and you would like it to be simulated, then I would be very grateful if you could send me the mean RTs for that particular study, and we can look at the multilink simulations for those data. Okay, here's an example of what our current integrated lexicon looks like. It has lines with translations of words for these different languages. So here you see, for instance, Dutch orthography and its frequency, Dutch phonology. We don't have separate frequencies for phonology, unfortunately. We have English orthography, English phonology, but we have also added Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, other languages there. Usually we work with about 1,500, 1,400 words for each language in order to get reasonable simulations, because when the lexicons are really small, you get more deviations. So this information is all used in the word retrieval process. So a particular input word arrives, and then all words in the lexicon are assumed to be at a resting level activation. And that resting level activation depends on the frequency with which those words are used in daily life. Words that are similar to the input are activated using the standard activation function from local connectionism, localist connectionism. So neighbors of the target are also activated a bit. And we determine the degree of activation of other words than the target on the basis of the degree of overlap. And there we use a measure from artificial intelligence called the Levenstein distance measure. The Levenstein distance measure allows the activation of words of different length as well. And then in the end, after the orthography and the phonology are activated on the basis of the input, we also go to semantic representations. And we have already looked at what happens when we have word association networks and there is spreading activation on the semantic measures. So the Levenstein distance is very useful, and it correlates very highly with assessments of similarities in orthography and phonology by human language users. And it counts every addition, removal, or exchange of letters that are necessary to change one word into another word. So if you have the English word text and you would like to change it into the French word texto, that would be one operation. And this Levenstein distance measure is normalized to account for word length differences. It partially solves the position specificity problem in the interactive activation model, and it can also handle simulations where we have words that are have their letters exchanged. Maybe you remember the Cambridge example where there's garbled text. So it also allows translation of words of different lengths. It can be used to account for priming tasks, as I will say later. When there are letters missing, then it can even introduce a kind of a patch. Okay, normalized Levenstein distance can also be applied to phonological representations, as has been shown by some research, some linguists. A very important aspect of this framework is that words are not just recognized in isolation, but they compete. There is a competition process that affects how quickly you can recognize the word. So this idea is implemented by in the multilink in terms of lateral inhibition. When the word becomes active, gets an activation above 0, it starts to inhibit the activation of other similar words. And we have a special parameter to account for that. And the simulations that involve lateral inhibition are a further addition to the model, but even without lateral inhibition, the model already does quite good. So the model can be applied to different types of materials, for instance. Finally, very importantly, we need an implementation of this task-specific processing. So how do people perform a particular task? They perform lexical decision in a different way from how they perform word naming. Therefore, we need a so-called task schemas. And David Green worked already on those and formulated some of them. We've been specifying them, and we are using them in the Java code of our multilink model. So for instance, if you do a lexical decision task, then you have certain requirements in order to give a response. If the word has a particular orthography and is identified and it belongs to a particular language, then you may respond on the basis of that word. And different languages have different instruction schemes or production schemes, you might say. They are all specified in this task decision system. So it's really important. Okay, well, I hope that by now you are up to looking at a particular simulation. So suppose that we have a Dutch-English lexicon and we present a word like dog to the model. What happens? Well, the model takes the input word and then starts to activate the word that belongs to the input. So in this case, the word dog in English. But it also activates other items that are similar but differ in one letter. For instance, the Dutch word dag or the Dutch word dom. They are partially activated because 2 out of the 3 letters are the same. So dag means day in Dutch and dom means dumb in Dutch. But you can see that as a language non-selective activation of word candidates. We usually assume that a word is recognized when its activation level surpasses a threshold of 0.72. So that is usually between 15 and 20 time cycles. So in this case, we can also see that semantics is activated, but it's not frequency sensitive. The green curve starts at -0.2, but we can also make the semantics sensitive to the frequency of the words, and that appears to lead to a slightly better simulation process when we look at semantic aspects. Okay, so what happens next? Well, after we have activated the orthography and the semantic information, well, actually at the same time as the semantics is activated, the phonology of the items is also activated. So the input orthographic activated representations activate phonological components and semantic components. So here, for instance, you can see the curves for dog in the spoken form and for hond. And they are implemented in our model in SAMPA and in IPA representation format. You can also see that the curves have a different form because the phonological and semantic information is only activated after the orthography was activated first. Because there is this spreading activation process throughout the mental lexicon, followed by resonance. Okay, here you see the activation of only a few nodes in the lexicon. And that is because we told the graphic function to do that, but there are actually many more items that become active than these few. So in fact, if you look at all the activated items, then there are 259 items that are temporarily activated. They are just activated just below 0, and then when you would have lateral inhibition, they would all be suppressed very quickly. But everything that is similar to the input is initially activated. Well, the interesting thing now is that when we introduce lateral inhibition, we can suppress this slight activation for many words that are not relevant anyway. So here you can see what happens when we have a considerable lateral inhibition. Many of these nodes have no longer become active above 0, and the rest is suppressed. And there are just a few items that remain active. And these can be, for instance, the cognates or the false friends in bilingual research. So this notion of lateral inhibition is very handy, and it can also be made task or context specific. So if we would assume that the degree of competition between words is different for different stimulus lists, then we can change that, and we have this parameter to fine-tune the results. So it can allow strategic use in a particular situation. Okay, lateral inhibition therefore affects the number of competitors, and here you can see that there are hundreds of competitors when we don't have lateral inhibition, and we have fewer when there is more and more lateral inhibition. If the lateral inhibition is set at a very high level, the only words that are activated are actually the cognates, for instance. Okay, so I hope that I've given you some impression of how the multilink model works. You can also try out the model yourself, because there is a website. Multilink can be found at 2 websites. There's the Donders website of the Faculty of Psychology and Social Sciences in Nijmegen, but there is also the Faculty of Arts, where the Center of Language Studies also give you the possibility of simulating with the multilink model. So when you type in multilink, you'll see that you can do these simulations yourself. Okay, what I want to do now is I want to show how the multilink model can be applied to empirical studies. And I've selected 3 studies today. The first is a lexical decision task on European Portuguese and Portuguese English data. The second is on a recently published paper of mine in bilingualism. It's on Dutch, English, orthographic semantic mask priming. And then I will show you that, contrary to what you might expect, lexical decision in Japanese with a very different script can also be simulated. So this is another study by Ellen and others that we will simulate. So let me go through these different studies and start with a study that you may be interested in because it's about Portuguese. So for our Portuguese-English simulation with multilink, we need Portuguese-English lexicon, we need frequency data, and we need empirical data to simulate. Well, fortunately, the Portuguese-English lexicon was not so difficult to make. We have collaborated with Montserrat Começanha and Ana Costa and others in Portugal to work on this. So we extended our Dutch-English lexicon. The word frequency data were also available, and they were available in a database that you may know very well, namely the Brazilian Portuguese database for subtitle frequencies. So even though we are doing a European Portuguese study, we will need to use these word frequency data because they are the best that we've got. Empirical data to simulate, there was always a problem. How many studies do we have? We need mean RTs for items. So that is the limiting factor, as I already explained earlier on. But here, what we did is we took 2 steps. We took a new database called 4-in-1 with over 6,000 items, and that was is in a paper that is in press in Behavioral Research Methods by Costa et al. And it's a very wonderful database with 4 languages, as I'll explain in a minute. And we also try to simulate empirical results in a lexical decision study from Arana et al. So first, we performed simulations for all these items in the 4-in-1 database. And this database contains word similarity estimates for words from American and British English, but also European Portuguese, German, and Spanish. And when we did those simulations, so we had over 6,000 comparisons between the frequencies of the items and the cycle times in multilinks, then we obtained a very high correlation. Well, in itself, that's not so surprising because multilink really aims at considering word frequency, but it picks up on that. And now you can consider all the simulations that we've done as predictions for expected reaction times in the future. So when we get empirical studies that make use of the 4-in-1 database, we can then select those items from those studies and we can compute a correlation for the reaction times with all the predictions that we have already made for a multilink. So we are really sticking our neck out now in trying to predict reaction times. However, we also have reaction times from this smaller empirical study. For instance, a study by Arana et al. And I would like to talk about those as well. So this is about European Portuguese English lexical decision task. And Arana et al. Presented people with different types of cognates, identical cognates, non-identical cognates, and also non-cognate control words. And these were very, very well matched on different dimensions. And they were incorporated in a number of experiments with different proportions of cognates. But here, what is important is that in experiment 1, they found a facilitation effect for identical cognates, but not for non-identical cognates. So 630 milliseconds for identical cognates, and then 695 and 700 milliseconds were the average reaction times for non-identical cognates and non-cognates. So this paper and some other papers by Montserrat Comensana and colleagues are about why identical cognates more or less take away the facilitation effect for non-identical cognates. However, what we are interested in here is, of course, how multilink simulates these results. So we did the simulations with the Portuguese-English lexicon and the subtitle frequencies in there, and we found quite high correlations of between the cycle times produced by multilink and the reaction times. As you can see across all items there, 79 items, we found a correlation of over 0.50. So that is, in my opinion, quite good performance because the word frequencies were not the actual European word frequencies, but Brazilian ones. There is a slight difference in how these different cultures use Portuguese. I'm sure about that because we found it also in Spanish, European Spanish, and South American Spanish. That is a study with Roberto Ferreira from Chile that I'm working on. Furthermore, multilink here assumed balanced bilinguals. We didn't have any lateral inhibition. And there was a very complex categorization by Arana et al. Because they split up orthographic and phonological similarity. This also explains why the number of items was not very, very high. Okay, I hope that this study was interesting to you, and I will show very different applications now. I will first show that the multilink model can also be used to simulate priming studies. So it has not been applied yet to priming studies in the literature, but we did this study that's now published in bilingualism. As you can see, we had a prime-target combination where the prime was presented for 50 milliseconds after hash mask, And it was also presented for 83 milliseconds experiment 2. And we checked prime duration with a digital oscilloscope to make sure that we were really looking at the right prime intervals. So what we were interested in was to see how facilitation effects due to overlap and inhibition effects due to overlap in form conspire and are combined. So as you can see, we had 4 different kinds of items in the experiment. They were all words that were different in 1 letter between Dutch and English. So for instance, we had a word like news in English. In Dutch, the word is nieuws, and that's just 1 letter different. So we had a representation on the basis of earlier papers that we wrote, and you can see how the form representation, the orthography, leads to a certain meaning representation and an activation of the semantics. Please also note that there are lateral inhibition links assumed between the word form representations. So what we were interested in is to see how orthographic overlap and semantic overlap lead to combined results in these 4 conditions. You can also look up the paper if you want to have more information. So here we have an example of the prime target combinations. Again, we had neighbor cognates, we had neighbors, translation equivalents, and unrelated pairs of items. People had to do a lexical decision in their second language where the prime was from their first language, Dutch. Okay, so here are the empirical results from the lexical decision study for the prime duration of 83 milliseconds. Well, as you can see, the cognates led to a facilitation effect relative to the unrelated items, and that was also the case for accuracy. Translation equivalence led to some activation, but the neighbors did not. So what do these results mean? Well, we believe that the cognate effects and the translation effects were facilitatory due to semantic overlap. And we believe that apparently the orthographic inhibition for the neighbor wasn't really very effective. So there was only a limited degree of lateral inhibition in the present study. When we correlate the experimental results that I just presented to simulation data for multilink, what we see is we get very high correlations for all different item types. All correlations are above 0.50 for a selected, very well matched item set. So we believe that this shows that multilink model really has captured some important characteristics of the underlying process, and that is also shown in these graphics, where we can see that simulations are really leading to a very similar figure. We see a slight inhibitory effect for the neighbors, not significant. We see nearly significant or significant translation effect, for probably due to semantics, and we see a strong cognate effect. And you have to realize that the cognate effect is particularly interesting because when it would combine the orthographic inhibition effect with a semantic effect, then the cognate effect should have been smaller than the translation effect. But as it really is the case, the cognate effect is much stronger. So people benefit from the orthographic overlap that converges on the semantics for cognates. So you can take another look at the proposed representations if you wish. Okay, then finally, I hope I haven't been speaking too fast, but I now want to move on to this Japanese lexical decision study in katakana. So again, we need a lexicon, frequency data, and empirical data. The lexicon and the frequency data were provided to us by my friend and colleague Koji Miwa from Japan, and we needed empirical data, and he also provided those. So as you may know, in katakana, the foreign words like the word architect or arcade that also occur in Japanese with a slightly different pronunciation are represented in katakana. So here you see Japanese orthography and phonology in a simplified way, and you see, again, English orthography and phonology. So how well can Multilink take into account non-Latin script languages? Well, you might wonder about that. How is it possible if you don't have an alphabet in the for a representation? Well, actually, in Japanese, for katakana, you can solve this problem because every sign or character in Japanese in the kana has a particular Unicode. And when we use this Unicode, we can make simulations, do simulations for these words for the Japanese lexicon. So here we have a lexicon of nearly 3,000 words. And then when we have an input a particular word, for instance, the word camera in English, then this will lead to the activation of its Japanese counterparts. And as you can see here, the word in Japanese is also being activated. And not only its orthography, but also its phonology, and of course, the semantics that it is supposed to share with the English items. So as you can see, when we have a proper representation of these words in Japanese, we can do simulations. And we have recently also been doing some studies with Chinese and with Japanese kanji in order to see if it's possible to come up with basic representations for multilink simulations in Japanese and Chinese. We can also apply this same principle to Korean, for instance. We have also looked at some of the very we were able to simulate those items, and then we got this wonderful booming correlation of 0.64. So it shows that the multilink model really captures, in my opinion, an important characteristic of human word recognition. That is the idea that you first set up a whole set of possible candidates that might be the same or similar to the input, and then you reduce that set to the item that you are really seeing or hearing. So this brings me to my summary and conclusion. I've presented a language user framework. The language user framework is a quite general, broad, and deep framework, a symbolic framework for all researchers interested in language. We have incorporated linguistic and psychological aspects in the model. We have considered comprehension and production, but also looked at task and decision components. And we have later then used this general framework, made it from a qualitative framework into a quantitative framework, and took out the word recognition component, word retrieval component, and we put that in this model that I've been talking about, the Multilink Plus model. Very importantly, we have been talking about all different kinds of levels in our studies. We have spoken about languages and language combinations. Every combination is unique. We have spoken about participants groups. Again, heritage speakers, children, and others behave differently. We have to incorporate that in our quantitative framework. We have suggested that different tasks lead to different processing. And we have spoken about different stimulus materials, cognates and non-cognates in the present presentation. So Multilink offers a means to study cognitive control issues. I've presented lateral inhibition as a component that could be seen as a structural characteristic of the language processing system, but it can also be strategically used. And on the basis of my recent work, I start to believe that lateral inhibition is not a structural component of the processing system, but a strategic component. Well, finally, what I did, and I hope you found it interesting, is that we applied Multilink Plus to several empirical studies testing cross-linguistic influence. We have applied it to lexical decision in Portuguese and Portuguese-English. We have applied it to lexical decision in Dutch-English with orthographic and semantic cross-linguistic priming. And we have shown that it may be expanded furthermore in the future to other language scripts. We are thinking especially first on scripts like those scripts used for Korean or Hebrew, or we can also try to apply to more complex scripts like Japanese kanji or Chinese Hanse. So I'm really happy to see that people are starting to pick up on this framework, because it helps thinking about particular phenomena. And as I said, it brings us all together in such a framework. And for instance, McFriederen and Lupker already provided a study in which they looked at Chinese English translation, where the basic interpretation of the data was done in terms of a multilink-like model. Okay, I hope that you have enjoyed and been able to follow my presentation. I would like to thank you for your interest, and I would also especially like to thank several people who helped me in collecting all the simulation data and empirical data and frequency data that underlies my present representation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tom. We're receiving a lot of messages of support, both from here and from the YouTube channel. And there are many people really happy to have the opportunity of attending one of your talks. So it was amazing. I think it would be useful for a lot of people, right? Both look and the multilink. So anyone who is interested can talk to you to provide some data to simulate, right?
Yes, please do.
So questions, guys? Or comments? Let's see if we have some in YouTube. Let's see if we have some in YouTube. Okay. Anyone? So I have some comments to make. Here, Danielle it's a great pleasure to listen to you, Professor. Danielle is saying, thank you very much for this excellent talk, Professor. Pedro is saying. And
thank you.
You know, when you show the triangle, I see that you.
Can you see it?
Yes, I see that you have, for instance, I understand that you can have similar ones interacting, right? For orthography 1, orthography 2, orthography 3, right? But
yes.
don't see the same thing happening with semantics, which means, for instance, that semantics is all alike in all languages. To me, if I see this, right? And we know from our experience as well that it's not exactly like that. What would you say about it?
Well, you're fully right. So in the present situation, we have been working only with translation equivalents, and they are assumed to be identical, but that is not, surely not even that is the case. For instance, if you have the Japanese word intabyu, then it is one of its meanings is the standard interpretation of interview, but interview is also used in English for different sorts of interviews, like job applications and so on. And the Japanese have a special word for that. So you are fully right. The semantics, as it is shown here, doesn't include any language-specific connotation to particular words, and surely the Portuguese word for mother has different connotations than the English word. However, this is not strictly a problem. So when we want, we can vary the degree of overlap, and therefore the degree of activation of particular nodes. And we can also have two different representations, one for the Portuguese word for mother and one for the English word for mother. And as a matter of fact, we have been investigating more regularly the whole organization of the semantic system. Because, for instance, in priming studies, you have one meaning priming another meaning. So, for instance, you can have doctor priming nurse. And then you need to know how strongly doctor and nurse are related. It turns out that word association is not one of the best ways to handle this kind of facilitation that you find in orthographic priming. It turns out that when you really start looking on it, then it's much better to use already available data from priming studies, for instance, the Hutchison database. So we are aware of issues here, and we are fully agreeing with you that there should be different or slightly different representations for semantics in different languages. The question is what stand you take theoretically on how these items are represented, because nobody really knows. And when we implement this, we therefore have to make a sophisticated guess when we want to do that. But we have shown that when we use priming data to organize the semantic interactions between semantically related words, then we get already very good results. And I mentioned Wessel Hisselaar in one of my collaborators, and he has done wonderful thesis, master thesis on these effects. So yes, this is something to be desired for in the future, Amanda.
Nice. I have other question, because also you assume all over like that orthography 1 and orthography 2 are completely different relationships, as well as phonology 1 and phonology 2. Well, from my thesis with you, by the way, we've seen that sometimes these are merged phonological representations, right? So I would like you to talk a little about that.
Yes, well, you're right about that. So when P1 and P2 would be amalgamated, as you have already shown in your doctoral thesis, then of course you need a different kind of representation there. We already admitted this also in our response to reviewers of our critical reviews of our paper in 2019. So yes, I do agree with you. But here again, you see the limitations of simulation work. Simulations need you to be completely specific about what is actually there. So, for instance, when you have a particular proposal for P1, P2 in an amalgamated way, then we could simulate that. But we need very specific proposals here. The same holds for a second language acquisition. It would be possible to simulate different lexicons over time with the multilingual model, but then they need to be specified in detail. So we need theoretical people, and we need researchers to come up with proposals of what exactly the lexicon looks like at a particular moment in time in order to be able to do the simulations. So you could say that this is a problem of the simplification that we currently have in the model. You could also say, well, this is a problem because our theories right now are not specific enough, and we need a concrete proposal on how all these words would look like when there is an amalgamation in a particular bilingual group. So we need specification of all of this. And in that sense, the framework has had to make particular simplifying assumptions. And especially because we are concerned with orthographic input, there are some real restrictions in terms of the phonological implementation.
But where you see limitations, I pointed those things out as potentialities for you to improve in the future, right? But it's excellent. You showed us that is quite close to what humans do, right?
Yes, no, I fully agree. So we are really happy that even with the current simplifications and even wrong representations, because that's, I mean, you have to admit that, even then we see that we get very high correlations, because we have found correlations of over 0.50 now for few and many items in all these different languages that I've mentioned. We have found extremely high correlations for Spanish. We have found reasonable correlations for French. We have now found considerable correlations for Italian and Dutch and English. They're all very high. So it means that apparently Multilink is really capturing some sort of a basic characteristic of word retrieval. But I do agree. We are fully aware of the simplifications and even the wrongness in terms of phonology and semantics.
That's great, Tom. I'm sure. I have questions for you. A lot of appraisals from our listeners, but I have a question from Leticia. Leticia says, thank you for the presentation, Professor Dijkstra. I would appreciate if you could talk a bit more about how the multi-link simulations work in terms of phonological overlap between languages. If phonology is activated after orthography and semantics, how to investigate this interlingual phonological overlap in reading tests. Could you get it?
Well, yes, well, thank you. Thank you very much for this interesting question. The question is also very important when we consider the 4-in-1 database and all the work that is associated with that. Of course, what is really shown by Montserrat Comesania and her co-workers is that when you consider these cognates effects, for instance, then when you base your results only on orthography, then you are disregarding some of the effects that arise from phonology. And those effects are not always facilitatory, they can also be inhibitory. And that has already been argued by me, myself, and I, in our 1999 paper. I thought afterwards, after the paper was published in JML in 1999, that we had made some error because we were unable to find this opposition between orthography and phonology in some of the studies with Christine Lemhoever. But I was really happy to see that Mons was able to come back to those results as well. Well, I have to say that because the phonological representations in the current model are oversimplified, I would say that the resonance that arrives back from phonology to orthography is not as it should be. The interesting phenomenon that we have observed is that nevertheless, in spite of some of the underrepresentation of phonology in the model is still able to account very well for translation production results. So we did a couple of simulations for translation production with cognates, interlingual homographs, and control words. Unfortunately, I was not able to talk about that, but we are working on a paper there, and we were able to replicate Natasha Tokovic and others' results for translation production between Dutch and English. So in spite of the simplified phonological representations, we still got very good results in word translation that has a spoken output. I would also like to add that one missing component in the multilink model right now are the sublexical representations. These are, of course, very important in word naming, and they also have to be considered to be read out from left to right, and they are missing in the current model. And that was because we wanted to make a clear distinction between this model and the Sophia model that I worked on with Walter van Heuven. But Walter and I have been in touch recently talking about whether it would be possible to have a kind of a sublexical representation, replacing the Levenstein distance computation that we are now using in these different corners of the triangle model. So yes, I have to admit the model is not really capable at the moment to represent phonological effects, and certainly not spoken language effects. And in that respect, the model is lacking empirical generalizability.
So you need more data to also, right? So everyone who's interested, right, Tom, can talk to you to provide some lexical decision or the word naming data, right, for you to help improve, right, your.
Yes, I would also be very happy when you write me an email explaining your question or your issue, because I understand there is always limited time during these presentations. So if you have a burning or urgent question or even a point of criticism, then don't hesitate to email me and to tell me what you like or what you hate about this model and whether you think it's worthwhile to pursue in the future.
I don't think anyone hates it. On the contrary, Tom, I think everybody's really excited about it. I have about 2 more questions. Would you be available to answer?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it's my pleasure.
Natalia Pinheiro is asking you concerning, can we add syntactic information in multi-link plus simulations?
Could you say that again?
Can we add syntactic information, syntax, right, in multi-link simulations?
Well, no, unfortunately, the model has really done kind of a surgical operation and has taken out the word retrieval system in the hope and belief that it could be studied on its own. But of course, when you look at this in a broader way in terms of the LUF, the language user framework, then word retrieval is really must be part of a larger context, sensitive model, which includes sentences and syntactic and semantic representations for sentences. So it doesn't consider that. As you can see, we have only word form representations here. For instance, we don't have morphological or lemma representations. In principle, this kind of a framework would allow it to build in these different other types of representations, like morphemes or lemmas, and they could then be made sensitive to syntactic information. However, this kind of a general framework can also be used at a sentence processing level, and together with people in Nijmegen, we have worked in the so-called ISLA project on idiom processing. And in the idiom processing project, we have built a model for idiom processing that includes a syntactic component, but it works quite differently from the multilink model. But it could take input from the multilink model in this syntactic sentence representation model, allowing us to simulate both individual word recognition and idiomatic information. So I'm currently also writing a paper with Louis ten Bos, a phonetician that you may know from Nijmegen. We are working on this idiom processing model. But no, we have really limited ourselves to word retrieval here. We have disregarded the syntactic aspects that are, of course, also essential in the broader language user framework.
So it's work for the future, right, Tom? Here we have another question, but then related to morphology by Leonardo Cabral. He asked, what is the role of morphological processing in your model? Or is morphology considered a phonological semantic relation between words? I remember two papers by Billy Cannon and colleagues, which differ phonological effects of word recognition from the effect of morphological family size. Is there room for including specifically morphological effects in your computational model?
Yes, again, a very interesting question. Of course, I mean, decades people have been talking about the independence of morphology from syntax and from phonetics and phonology. I do believe that we could have separate morphological components. I said that syntax isn't incorporated in the model. Well, the same is at this moment true for morphology. However, morphology would be a bit easier to implement. Of course, we could look, for instance, at inflection and derivation. And for instance, we have been considering Bahasa Indonesian for as a language to be implemented in the multilink model. Under those circumstances, we would need some sort of a compounding where you have a processing component that can recognize two different items with a space in between. For instance, if you have orang, you would need two components that later are combined. Similarly, when you would look at plural of nouns, for instance, and you look at the plural of gardens, then you could implement that reasonably easily in the multilink model. But again, we would need to extend the model in terms of its Java code, and we would need to have a very precise morphological specification that can be implemented. But that would be a little bit easier to do, but it would still be a lot of work because the morphological, the morphemes would also need to be then linked up to semantic components like the meaning of the stem and the plurality aspect of it. But that would be really interesting because then we could start to look at, for instance, this interesting phenomenon where the gender in terms of semantics may be confounded with the gender in terms of the noun. So I'm thinking of this distinction that was also pointed out by Lira Boroditsky on, for instance, is it correct that in Portuguese you have a ponte, and then in Italian you would have la ponte, la ponte, and then there's a distinction or le pont in French. There is a distinction in the gender there that may have consequences for semantic processing. So not done, but very interesting. And as you can see, the model already provides a kind of a Gedanken experiment, as the Germans would say, on how this could be implemented or how it could work. So this kind of a computational model for me has a lot of research generativity as an output. Well, you may remember Judy Kroll's revised hierarchical model. Even though it was a very simple model with just a few boxes, hundreds of papers have led to have been based on it. Very, very interesting. We hope that multilink can fulfill a similar role, but this is the next generation where the model itself is also quantified and implemented.
Thank you, Tom. There's a last question that I think is interesting because we rarely speak about how models or research that we do experimentally work with less known languages, right? So this is the question of Pietra Cassol Higati. She asks, are there any future projects for testing it with minority languages? It would be amazing to test multilink with Haitian Creole and Brazilian Portuguese as well.
Yes, so again, thank you very much for all these wonderful questions. They are really thought-inspiring. So one thing that can be done, of course, is you could easily implement different dialects, because you could, as long as you keep the dictionary more or less the same, or the vocabulary, then what you can do is you can start to adjust the relative frequencies. You can also go to languages that just have a few different letters. So, for instance, we did a study on Norwegian English. Norwegian has some letters that are really different. But of course, when you start to talk about Creole, then you're entering a different domain. And I'm thinking about the wonderful work by Poplek, for instance, and about all sorts of code switching studies. Well, to a certain degree, some of this work can be replicated. Could have these kinds of priming studies there, but we would need to specify again the what happens in Creole languages. For instance, one thing that I haven't been talking about is the role that this middle part here in the model plays. These different language nodes. The language nodes are representing the language of the items. They are not doing very much in the current version of the model, but as we know, for instance, for Creole, people are easily switching between the different languages that they know, and this is really very interesting because it seems to suggest that there is not just competition between the languages, but there may also be collaboration between the languages. And this again suggests that lateral inhibition is not a structural or a property in the architecture of the model, but it is dependent on the situation at hand. And by varying the contribution of the different language nodes, we could point at different items that are selected. And I don't know if the person who asked this question knows, but I've done several studies with Kootstra and Van Hel on code switching, and I was a friend and a colleague of Peter Muysken, late Peter Muysken, who I tremendously admire and who did a lot of research on South American languages and also looked at code switching and code mixing in different situations. So for now, I would say that Creole would be too ambitious for me to simulate. What I first would like to do is extend the model, for instance, looking at Quechua or look at the differences between European Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese in terms of vocabulary, different frequencies of items. And this project I've started with Roberto Ferreira in Chile, and we have already collected some very interesting results on items that are used only in South America and not in Europe, and how this affects the processing in Multilink. But again, very, very interesting question. It would take a lot of empirical new research and manpower to implement and test in the current Multilink model.
Thank you so much, Tom. A lot of people here, well, the ones who asked questions are thanking you for your answers, right? And a lot of the viewers are thanking the opportunity of listening to you and attending to one of your talks. And this is something that I'm very thankful about as well. I'm really sorry that I couldn't work well in the introduction. Your introduction, but you actually don't need. A lot of people know you around the world, right? I hope you know that. And people are really excited to listen to your talk. I just want to say that he was my supervisor, guys. Sorry that not everyone could have this opportunity, but I'm very thankful that I could be his PhD student.
Yes, again, thank you very much, and I want to thank you from two perspectives. As a colleague and a person that I love to work with, we are both interested in our shared hobby, looking at languages. You taught me a lot about phonetics, and we discovered a lot about phonetics. But I would also like to thank you for your friendship and for thinking of me under these circumstances. And I hope that that as a community we can function more like friends and less like competitive colleagues. So, referring back to the Multilink model, I don't think the Multilink model really needs competition and lateral inhibition. but I'm certainly sure that we, as colleagues of this world community and world citizens, don't need competition either. We need collaboration, because this is the exciting wonder, mystery, miracle of our life. How do we study language, and what can we? How can we talk about it? We need a lot more researchers instead of fewer people, and we need to collaborate a bit more.
That's great, Tom. Thank you so much for that last advice, which is very important indeed. And there will be more questions, but in reason of time and to give you a break, I'll ask these colleagues who have questions to direct it to you via email, right?
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you for everyone who's attending. And see you soon, I hope.
Bye-bye.
Guys, we'll have a short break before the presentations begin.
Thank you very much.
See you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Tom. Marido. Você colocou só no final, né, a lista. Tenta colocar de novo aqui, se tiver alguém ainda. Mas o legal seria colocar em vários momentos, assim, né, durante a gente deixa rodando aqui ou para um pouquinho o streaming e começa de novo. Tá bom.